Welcome to Colourful. I'm just going to start by reading a statement that we came up with from Irish Community Services. The murder of George Floyd left us enraged and heartbroken. The subsequent protests that cascaded across the country and then around the globe demanded more than accountability from law enforcement and elected officials. Each of us were being called upon to take up a mantle of forging racial justice. Each of us were being asked to reflect on who we are and what we believe in. Like many of you, we at Irish Community Services have been grappling with what these questions mean for us as members of the Irish community. Furthermore, we have been considering what it means for us as a human service organisation with a mission statement that reads, to serve, empower and connect the Irish and Irish American community of the Midwestern United States. While we understood that we had an obligation to act, we didn't know what action to take or what impact we could have on an issue as pervasive and damaging as racism. We believe a commitment to seeing our shared humanity is key to ending racism. This kind of empathy starts with listening to the experiences of others and believing what we are told. This morning's gathering is a modest start to the work that lies ahead in making our community settings and institutions safe and welcoming for all of us. Today, we are creating an opportunity to deepen our understanding of racism in our community and the impact it is having on those who fall outside an enduring, narrow, and unbending notion of what it is to be Irish. We want to honour and support the people of colour in our community and celebrate the diversity that they embody that enriches all our experiences of being Irish. We have selected a wonderful panel and moderator who represent a variety of lived and professional experiences related to diversity, inclusion, and Irish identity. And we'll be asking them to share their insights with us as we challenge contemporary issues of race and racism through an Irish lens. We thank them for their generosity, and we also thank our friends at the Ireland Network Chicago, who have supported this event and share our vision of a more inclusive and colourful Irish community. So just a bit of housekeeping. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a couple of functions. If you have any questions for our panelists, we will have a 10 minutes at the end of this conversation to have questions. So if you have questions, just put them in the question and answer box. There's also a chat feature where you can chat amongst yourselves. You can talk to the other people who are on the call as well, the attendees and also the panelists. And then there's also a raise your hand function. Don't do that. Stay away from that one. So before we get into it, I wrote a couple of words from myself. So I wanted to read this out for you guys. Céad Míle Fáilte. For those of you who don't know, that's how Irish people say welcome. It directly translates as 100,000 welcomes. So I'll tell you a bit about myself. My name is Grace and I'm Irish from Dublin, but I've lived in Chicago for 6 years and I'm the Youth and Family Engagement Coordinator for Irish Community Services. I am so used to walking into a room of Irish people and being the only person of colour. And I've been telling myself for years, I can't be the only brown Irish person in Chicago, or I can't be the only brown Irish person over here in the Midwest. And it got me wondering, is there space for people of colour at Irish events? Are we welcomed or are we encouraged to attend? Do you know any people of colour who are also Irish? These are questions that you should just, sit with and think about. The one big thing that I wanted to say is that it's time to change the Irish people are white narrative because it's simply not true. I hope to be one day accepted as being Irish without having to get real dub on you or without having to whip out my Irish passport. Remember, tolerating racism is racism. Being willfully ignorant to racism is racism. You have a personal responsibility to acknowledge and oppose racism. Let's open up our circles and welcome Irish people of all shades. And now I'm going to hand it over to our moderator. I will just introduce her really quickly. So our moderator today is Fiona Odemuso. Fiona is an Irish-Nigerian immigrant who left Dublin in 1999 to pursue her higher education at Columbia College, Chicago. She later earned a master's degree in integrated marketing communications from Roosevelt University, Chicago, and currently works in digital marketing for an American CPG brand. She lives in Aurora, Illinois with her husband and 2 children. The floor is yours, Fiona.
Thank you, Grace. Welcome again. Thank you for having me today. I'm very excited about this panel. I wanted to also kind of share a little bit about myself. When I thought about, what to share, I wanted to share 3 personal truths. And really, my experience as an Irish-Nigerian woman has very similar to Grace's experience in the fact that coming to the US, I have never really felt connected or really celebrated by the Irish American community. In addition to that, I would say that my experience is a little bit different because I actually fell in love with an amazing Black man. And so we have raised our 2 kids outside of Chicago. And my experience being married to a Black man, I have definitely seen on the sidelines as well as the front lines that racism in America is definitely alive and well. It's not always hateful, but it's definitely there. It is one of those things that I think as the Irish American community, as we talk about what does that mean to us, I think of a trip that I took to Mississippi a couple of years ago when I was then a fiance of my husband to meet his family. And I met with a lot of the elders in his community, and I had such a shocking experience when I looked at them and I saw so many of his great aunts that looked Irish. Their last name was Boylan. They had a lot of Irish ancestry names. And I thought to myself, what is the connection between the history of Irish America and Black America? And so that is something that I just put out to us today as we explore on the panel and we have our conversations, that I think that there's a lot of history and intersection. And I think it's, as humans, as Irish Americans, it's our duty to really have these hard conversations. And so with that, I would like to introduce our panel. I think that we're going to have a very open and honest conversation today. And so first of all, I would like to introduce Lorraine Maher. Lorraine is the founder and director of IAm Irish. She is a mixed race Irish woman of Irish Nigerian ethnicity from County Tipperary. She works between Dublin and the UK. Lorraine is an experienced community cultural advisor, educator, trainer, speaker, creative practitioner, producer, and curator. She's a very busy woman. And so welcome, Lorraine. Thank you for joining us today. And then secondly, I would like to introduce Kevin Byrne, who is the new Consul General of Ireland to Chicago. In the Irish Foreign Services, he has served in the EU Division, Corporate Services, and in Ireland's Consulate in San Francisco. He has worked in the Department of the Taoiseach, Prime Minister, and with the Orásan Uachtaráin, the Office of the President of Ireland. Welcome, Kevin. And then lastly, but not least, we have Michael O'Shea. Michael is joining us today. He is a higher education professional who has held a number of positions with the US and Canadian nonprofit organizations, as well as educational institutions in advising, teaching, and community engagement roles. As a public servant, he has served the US federal government as well as local elected officials in Chicago. He's a committed activist. Michael currently serves on the next board of New Leaders Council, which is a nonprofit organization that nurtures the next generation of young progressive leaders. He's a proud product of Chicago Public Schools, shout out to the CPS, and is now pursuing his PhD in higher education at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Michael. So I think to get the conversation started, in order for us to know where are we going in the future with this conversation about racism, I would like to ask each of you, from your own perspectives, how would you describe the current situation in the Irish community as it relates to racism and inclusion? And I will ask Lorraine if you could take that question first for us. Oh, Lorraine, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was just realising as I started to talk that I was still muted. First and foremostly, thank you for inviting me to this conversation, and thank you for having this conversation. When you asked me that question, I feel a little emotional from even listening to what Grace had to say at the top of this session, because just to reiterate that going into Irish spaces in the UK and in Ireland, there's been many times I feel like I don't fit, or I'm not accepted in that kind of place. So when I think of a word to describe how things are in Ireland at the moment, I would say bleak. And the word that comes to mind for me is like razor edge. Because we've seen, since the murder of Mr. Floyd in May, we've seen like a global response to that. And yet this week in Dublin, race hate crime is going through the roof. So there's so much work still to be done. Yeah.
Kevin, would you like to take that question?
Sure, yeah, and sorry I got knocked off there. My internet wasn't great, but again, thanks for including me in the conversation. It's great to be part of it. I think it's a really important discussion that you guys are having, and the Consul's really happy to be a part of it. Yeah, I think I'd echo what Lorraine said. Obviously, Ireland's made huge strides in respect to certain minorities in recent years, and I think particularly to the LGBTQ community. But I think in particular, Irish of mixed race or black or brown Irish people, I think they probably do suffer, probably still to quite a significant degree. I'm from Dundalk, just in the border region, and only this week there was a family that suffered, quite severe racial abuse over a number of weeks, and they actually had to move out. There have been some steps taken recently. The government announced the creation of a new panel, an anti-racism panel that's going to put together an action plan against racism. And this is something that I think is quite hopeful. But again, I think it's something that we really need to move forward on.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Michael, would you like to take that?
Absolutely. And again, like others have said, thank you for this opportunity to speak. Thanks for hosting this panel. Unfortunately, events every day remind us of the urgency of this conversation. So I feel very lucky today to be able to represent my family and my siblings on this call. I think, like Lorraine said, I think the situation is fraught. I'm speaking as a white Irish American male who grew up in Chicago. That's my perspective. I think there's work to do in the Irish community around inclusion. I think many of us white Irish Americans have a notion of what Irish American is, what it looks like, what kind of phenotype that is. So there's definitely room that needs to happen in broadening that umbrella. And the second piece, racism. I've been encouraged by Irish Americans who have stepped up and supported Black Lives Matter in this moment. But I've also seen the opposite response, which is discouraging. That is using our history of being colonized, of being oppressed as an excuse to not take action and a denial of racism in this moment. So I think it's a critical point for white Irish Americans to decide on what side of history they want to be on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so as we kind of talk to, being anti-racist is having those hard conversations, that on the flip side of being anti-racist is the verb of doing something. And so Lorraine, I know that you are very active as this is a passion mission for you. Can you tell us more about what IAm Irish is and the work that you do?
Sure. Before doing that, I'd just like to say, so, when you introduced me, and of course I put forward for myself that I'm half Irish, half Nigerian, but I didn't know that actually until like about 18 months ago. So I grew up in Ireland as an Irish person, a brown-skinned Irish person, but had no kind of Nigerian identity whatsoever. So the only identity that I've ever had close to me and been able to pass on to my family is the identity of being Irish. So I created a project in 2016 that kind of spoke to my frustrations of the continued lack of representation of my experience and all the talk and thoughts of a new Irish community and thinking like, hold on a minute now, like, you know, I'm cracking on. I've got grandchildren. I'm not new. And there are people that could be my grandparents that were born and brought up in Ireland. They're not new. So I created a movement. IAm Irish is a creative movement that maps the roots, the lives and experiences of Irish people who happen to be mixed race. And our vision is for an equitable and inclusive Irish society where Irish people of mixed ethnicity are fully represented in all aspects of the global Irish experience. Now, I have to say, since creating the project, we're continually looking at that, and it's living and breathing, because since even unraveling, you know, the notions of Irishness, and a lot of what IAm Irish is about challenging perceptions of what it looks like and what it sounds like to be Irish. And that's spoken to a much wider voice. And there's lots of the issues that affect us as being ancestrally Irish and being of a biracial or multiracial background, the Afro-Irish community or the Asian Irish community in Ireland are also resonating with. And also we know that there's quite a number of people who would identify as being Caucasian in Ireland who've adopted children from African and Asian countries. So they come from a multi-ethnic Irish family that are born and brought up in Ireland. So I hope that's answered your question. I was about to go off, like I could do an hour on my own talking about all the issues that there are.
Yeah.
Great, Fiona.
And I think, just personally, on a personal note, I got really emotional when I found IAm Irish, and actually it was 2020, this year, that I found your online presence and started to kind of look into what that meant. And I started to kind of analyze it. I think growing up mixed race for me, being Irish Nigerian, but being connected somewhat to my Nigerian family through my dad, is very isolating, very, very isolating. And so you feel like you're always the only one, which is, over time, it's kind of exhausting. I will say there's times that people have asked me, like, you know, oh, where are you from? And I just don't have the energy to have, oh, you know, I'm Irish, but like, I know I don't look Irish. So I will just say, on behalf of mixed race people, on behalf of myself, thank you for the work that you do with IAm Irish. Very exciting to see the future is bright with that. And so when we speak of, you know, what's happening, you know, in general, as we go forward, I think the government and just how, you know, leadership can play a role in that, I think that's just as important. And so this question is for you, Kevin. As you know, go into your new role, which you know, pretty new within the last month or so, you're going to be responsible for, you know, the entire country, the government and its diaspora. But how do you and your colleagues prepare to approach this role that in a way that will embrace diversity as well as inclusion?
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, again, I'm about a month in and very happy to be here. So hello to everybody on the call. I can't see you, but I look forward to meeting you in the coming months and years. We do quite a lot of preparation. The Department of Foreign Affairs recently, in the last number of years, really took a deep dive and started to look at how we as a department represent, you know, an increasingly diverse Ireland. I think something people aren't really aware of is about 17, close to 18% of people in Ireland weren't born in Ireland. So really we are, you know, really quite a diverse population. Traditionally, diplomats and people in the Department of Foreign Affairs have been, you know, male, white, straight, middle class. And that has definitely been I suppose, the perception of what a diplomat is. And really what we've tried to do is look at how we as a department really do represent, the full strands, the whole pattern of everybody in Ireland and right through the Irish community. So we had a whole series of conversations and talks where we looked at different aspects of Irishness. So we looked at, you know, issues of gender, of race, of income inequality, of sexual orientation, religious affiliation, to really look at how we properly represent, I suppose, the full richness of the Irish family and not just, you know, one strand of Irishness. So it's something that we really take very, very seriously. And then I suppose projects like Lorraine's really do help to shine a light, as she said, on, you know, people who've been Irish their whole lives. And they're, you know, as she said, it's, you know, she didn't just suddenly become Irish. She has been a part of the Irish family for quite some, you know, for her whole life, as have people before her. So really what we're trying to do is to be able to represent, I suppose, the full richness of the Irish nation. And that's something that we take quite seriously. So it's something we'll be doing more on in our new diaspora strategy. I think we'll have a chance to talk about that maybe a little bit later.
Absolutely. And then Michael, for you, I read your article in Chicago Sun-Times, and as a fellow writer, I was really impressed with just the words that you put, you know, from pen to paper. When we talk about racism, there's a lot of times there's comparisons made to, well, when the Irish came to America, they were treated, you know, worse than slaves. And I know there was quite a few memes that were going around, you know, with all the social media that was happening where you were comparing Irish people with, you know, the history of slavery. But I think a lot of times that sometimes can subdue what really, you know, the role or the comparison of slavery and Irish immigration are just totally different, you know, social history of America. And that's something that you wrote about in your article. Can you expand on that concept and kind of tell us a little bit more about your perspective on that concept?
Absolutely. You know, that's not an easy conversation to have, and one that I think is difficult for a lot of white Irish Americans to have. I agree that, you know, this parsing apart or this race to the bottom, comparing, you know, which was worse, Irish immigration or slavery, isn't helpful. I will say that the Irish experience was not slavery, so that comparison shouldn't be made. So I think for Irish Americans, white Irish Americans in this moment, I think there needs to be a little sort of mental balancing where, yes, you can accept that Irish Americans have experienced discrimination. Ireland has been colonized by England for centuries. Yes, Irish folks in the US experienced discrimination. Yes, there was anti-Catholic sentiment. But for white Irish Americans, for white Irish American Catholics like myself, that's not the case anymore. White Irish Americans do not experience discrimination based on the color of their skin. I think, unfortunately, as I alluded to earlier, many white Irish Americans in this moment use that history as an excuse to stand on the sidelines of the fight for racial justice, or worse, use it as an excuse to put down the experience of Black Americans or deny the existence of racism. And I think that's not just disappointing and wrong, but a lost opportunity. I think if you really dig down, shouldn't an experience of oppression be an opportunity for empathy and to stand in solidarity with a group that's being currently oppressed? Irish Americans are not oppressed now. They were in the past. Black Americans continue to be oppressed. So why can't that be an opportunity for solidarity and for empathy?
And just to expand on that, Michael, I think you kind of hit on something, and I kind of alluded to it in my opening, that there was a history, you know, with where, you know, during the discrimination against the Irish immigrants, Black and Irish people were often working together, maybe living in certain similar areas, or, you know, there was an intermixing. I know that I'm also a member of an organization of biracial women, who a lot of them have done their ancestry and found quite a significant Irish DNA. Why do you think it evolved to where it's now, to your points, you know, a lot of Irish Americans are either turning, you know, the other cheek and not acknowledging? Just curious if you had any thoughts on that as we've progressed in our society.
Sure, and I wouldn't pretend to be, you know, a sociologist or an expert on race relations. But I will say the book, How the Irish Became White, did influence my thinking. I think it would be helpful for some white Irish Americans to do some digging and understand the history of Black-Irish relations. I think, yes, there was intermixing. There may have been attempts at early solidarity, but also many instances of violence and conflict. Personally, I think some of that is a system in the US that pitted people on the lowest rung of the ladder against each other. I'm thinking of the South Side of Chicago, as Irish immigrants and Black Americans competed for scarce housing and jobs. And as white Irish Americans tasted some of the advantages that came along with being white, it became very easy to then put down Black Americans.
Good point. So as we speak about being Irish, right, identity is like what comes to mind. And so when you think of Irishness, a lot of times whiteness is described with that. A question for you, Lorraine, what impact do you think this, perception of whiteness with Irish has had for Irish people of color?
Well, I mean, it's at the root of everything, isn't it? Because when you think, I'm currently doing an artist residency that's looking at the Irish census form, and currently on the Irish census form, there's two colors, one continent and another. You can be white Irish, you can be white traveler, you can be white other things. You can actually be black Irish on the Irish census form. You can be Asian Irish or Chinese, or you can be other. And so I became really interested on the census around the world that identifies Irish people as being white. That's the, you can be a white Irish traveller, but you're still white. And I think that feeds into all of those kind of narratives. And then we see, lots of third, fourth generation white Irish people who've never set foot actually in Ireland, but are really passionate about who they are as Irish people, who create all these narratives. And unfortunately, a lot of that feeds into media, the films that we see, the stories that we're told, has all this kind of representation of what an Irish person looks like. So there's this idea, I think, particularly when we're looking at Irish Americans, that we're still in kind of flat cap and everybody is in Aran sweaters and everyone plays the violin. And that's not what Ireland is about. It's still a beautiful country. And you can go to museums and you can see all aspects of that life of Ireland. But Ireland has a very different view. I also think, and I don't want to go into this too deeply, but there was lots of narratives that we were given as children through the church, actually, about the starving black baby, and given all of these images that somehow that those that came from the African continent were separate to who we are. And there's, when we think about the Celts and the Normans, we never hear about all the other stories. We never hear about the stories of, in the 17th, 18th centuries, when abolitionists went to Ireland, when some people settled in Ireland that have been there, or actually even when you go back further than that to Irish mythology that talks about North Africans, being on the island when white people turned up. Or, if we really go, actually, I'm going way off now into genealogy and kind of looking at the origins of man. It always really surprises me when we look, on the island of Ireland, we've got a population of 6.5 million when we look at the 32 counties, but actually there's 80 million across the globe of people of the Irish diaspora. How could we not have mixed and blended as life has gone on? It doesn't make sense that we continually be white, but yet we have, it feels to me in lots of ways, a population of people that are so tied to their own privilege that they're finding it really difficult and scared that they might lose some of that. And, just going back to what we're talking about around the transatlantic slave trade, I mean, there's no comparison to what happened, and that's not taken away from the sheer oppression and the horrible nature of the things that happened to us as Irish people at that time. But I think, like with any kind of community, when they're just above the surfaces, they're scared sometimes that they might lose that bit of power, so that they don't want to move that or shift that in any way, to shine a light on themselves, to say that I want to be seen in case that they're also treated in the same kind of way. And we saw that, in the UK around the 60s when there was a Windrush population from the Caribbean that came to the UK, and a lot of Irish people, because of economics, coming to London at the same time, and we saw signs in the windows that said no dogs, no blacks, no Irish. And so, but what we forget is all of those moments in time that have actually brought us together as communities. There's actually so much that we can learn from each other, so much that we've come through together. I've gone off again, Grace, on your actual question about white Irishness. I just also thought that I have some resources that actually IAm Irish is part of a wider network of anti-racism work in Ireland. I'm happy to put them in the chat box if that's okay.
Great. No, thanks, Lorraine. That's, I mean, I think it's very important, the conversations that we're having, and so I'm happy share as much as you feel on your heart. So, and so as we talk about, again, going back to you, Kevin, about just how we're going to put, process and policy in place. I know that since 2015, the Government of Ireland has had an official diaspora policy, which outlines some of the objectives of engaging the global Irish community. I know the current updated policy was delayed a little bit because of the pandemic, but can you talk to us about where diversity and inclusion fit into that 2015 policy and what we can expect from the updated policy to come?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, as you said, in 2015, we launched Global Irish, which was a dedicated policy to support and engage and strengthen our diaspora. One of the smaller strands in that in 2015 was really the need to start to reach out into newer elements of the, well, not necessarily newer elements of the diaspora, but maybe elements of the diaspora that we hadn't focused on previously. So I suppose there are three strands that we were looking at there, which were trying to reach out to younger, so I suppose that newer generation of people who had Irish heritage right across the world. We really wanted to foster women's empowerment. So some of you may have attended some of the Brigid's Day celebrations, which really focused on the contributions of women in the diaspora. And then the third was, I suppose, diverse global Irish. So those what we would have called non-traditional communities. So Irish communities that may not have been a focus before. So from that came, a celebration of Black Heritage Month in certain missions around the world. In New York, they recently launched an African-American Irish network, really to look at those links between the African-American community in the States and in Ireland. And it's interesting what you mentioned, if you look back, I suppose, through the genealogy of it. One study says that about 38% of African Americans have some element of Irish heritage and ancestry. And I suppose really what we wanted to do is see why in certain places these links hadn't been made before. I suppose why communities diverged and chose, I'm African American or I'm of Irish heritage. Why there weren't those links between the two. In the new strategy, which we hope to have launched later on this year, really that strand of looking at the more diverse Irish diaspora is something that's been pulled up right into one of the big pillars of the strategy. So really the focus of one of the strong focuses is to look and support that diverse diaspora and really start to ask those questions around Irishness and Irish identity, because as Lorraine said, we're a country of sort of 5-6 million, but we've a diaspora that's about 80 million strong right across the world. And Irishness has always been influenced by our diaspora. We've never just been, one island, and that has solely influenced who we are and what Irishness is. So really what we want to do with the new strategy is to spark even more of these conversations and to look into where these diasporas are and how we can start to connect links between, I suppose what we would call the traditional Irish diaspora and then I suppose the lesser the lesser focused on aspects of the diaspora. So that's something. So this conversation is something that we're really keen to see continue.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kevin.
I just wanted to interject for a second.
Absolutely.
I see some great conversation happening here on the chat here. Some links and articles that that take down this myth of Irish slavery, and I'm moved to also say that in reading white Irish American Twitter over these past few weeks, it's enraging to see how many white Irish Americans both deny the existence of racism today and to make this a false claim that white Irish Americans continue to be oppressed. There was an Irish American president 60 years ago. When I go for a run here in Boston, there are buildings with Irish last names. There's a Sullivan Veterans Center. There's a Quigley Home for veterans. If I'm pulled over by a police officer, there's a good chance that cop is not only white, may have an Irish last name. So I'm not likely to be killed in that police interaction. So if there are white Irish Americans on the fence out there, or denying the existence of slavery, I would very emotionally encourage you to do some introspection, to do some learning.
That's great.
Sorry,
and I think,
can I just interrupt just for 1 second, just to remind people that the question and answer box is there. If you have any questions for our panelists, just type them in so we can have them ready for when we're going to our question and answer part of this discussion.
Yeah, and I think thanks, Michael, for sharing that. And I think, you know, myself as well, you know, just, you know, going through life in the US, I think in the beginning I really kind of wanted to see the best of, like, oh, you know, Irish people are just so friendly, we're so, you know, we just embrace all, you know, and that's how my family were. And so one thing that comes to mind is I had applied for an apartment in Chicago, and obviously with my first name, you know, the landlord, Irish American, great, Fiona, love that, come on over, see it, you know, came over. As soon as she saw me, she was so confused. First of all, she's like, oh, you're Fiona? And I said, yeah, for the apartment. And then somehow we got talking. She asked if my fiance was Black, and I said, oh, he is, but, you know, what's that got to do with anything? She's like, I couldn't rent to you. I've never rented to a Black person in my building, and I don't want to start now. That was about in the 2000s. So it wasn't the 60s, the 70s, you know, where we think, oh my gosh, that happened a long time ago. And so I think for me, it's just really understanding that we have to just be real. I think I've seen the two worlds of being a lighter skinned mixed race person, but then also connecting with the Irish Americans in Chicago, that there is still a lot of prejudice that, you know, and just blatant racism that we need to address and have those conversations. So Michael, I do want to kind of go back to you a little bit, because that article, like I said earlier, which we should probably link and encourage everyone to read, you talked about, I'll quote you actually, you said, as we reflect critically on our position as Irish Americans, we must challenge what it means to be Irish in the United States. Now, as we get into that conversation here, my question to you is, what do you think it means to be Irish in the United States right now? Obviously, everything going on from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor, I mean, it's just one thing after the other when it comes to racism. I'd like to understand, like, what your position is on that when it comes to being Irish currently.
Sure. I think at the risk of harping too much on comments I see on Twitter, one, I think, layer to what I said earlier is, yes, an Irish American, white Irish American might experience hardship in their life in the States. We all experience some kind of hardship, might be poverty or mental health, but critically, they're not going to experience hardship because of the color of their skin. I think that's a point that's lost in some of the very passionate back and forth on what I would call white Irish American Twitter. In reference to our article, what it means to be Irish, gosh, I've learned so much from today's panel. Even in preparing for the panel, I had to expand my notion of what I think it means to be Irish in America. Growing up in Chicago, I never met an Irish person of mixed ancestry. I remember there was one Black girl that I saw in an Irish dance class, and she stood out, and I think the room noticed. And looking back on that instance, I can't imagine how maybe out of place that that Black girl felt in that room. So one, to be Irish, again, I think we're at a juncture. There's a community of white Irish Americans who I think have an idea of what Irishness looks like, at some of the characteristics or stereotypes that you described. You know, that was an accurate picture of our community 100, 150 years ago, even 50 years ago, perhaps, when a lot of white Irish Americans immigrated. I'm thinking in particular to Chicago. But our community globally has changed. We only have to look at the former Taoiseach in Ireland, who was, you know, born to Irish and Indian parents. Modern day Ireland is diverse. And so for white Irish Americans, we need to accept that fact and know that our community has always been diverse. So in this moment, again, my hope is that Irish Americans, white Irish Americans, instead of using their own history as an excuse to stay on the sidelines, deny racism, hide behind absurd Irish Lives Matter t-shirts or signs, but rather to step up, to dig down to their own history. If they're religious, to dig down into their religion and find a cause for solidarity, to be outraged, to find racism sinful and to step up in this moment.
Thank you, Michael. That's a good call to action. Lorraine, as we look forward to signs of progression, because, you know, that's why we're all here. We all have hope that, you know, things can get better, and we want to make things better for the future generations. Can you share any positive examples of efforts of creating anti-racist and inclusive Irish settings, how they've worked well and why they were effective?
I've been really thinking about that, actually, and I think that, so I've shared lots of resources today, and a lot of that's come from IAM, which is the Irish Network Against Racism. And so there's a number of different, there's 120, in fact, organisations in Ireland that mix from, you know, small organisations to council bodies to corporate companies that have come together to really try to stamp out racism. And one of the resources that organisation, that network has created is something called iReport. And it's a way of being able to record incidences of race hate in Ireland, because shockingly, we still don't have any race hate legislation. So even if someone goes to the guards, their hands are kind of tied, the police, their hands are kind of tied as to how much, you know, how far they can go with that. So I think that when we're even looking at incidents of racism, sometimes unless something really, you know, vicious happens, it's often not recorded within the kind of criminal justice context in the right kind of way. So that network is really working hard towards that. And of course, all of us as organisations and under like the work that I'm doing is consistently wanting to be able to shine that light, wanting to give that gift actually to other Irish organisations, because one of the things that has been really clear to me is that often White Ireland feels very nervous about having the conversation, even when they're just talking to other White Irish people. They often worry about the language they're using or how that's going to come across. And so I've always kind of put myself out there, and the work that I do and IAM Irish as an organisation, to be open to those kind of conversations. And, you know, we wanted to work with organisations to help them to bring the policies on their shelf to life, to look at how they work in an everyday way. And often that is about asking people what they want rather than making presumptions about what's wanted or what's needed. And I think that that's a kind of a shift. And, you know, I know that the Irish government has putting together the anti-racism panel. I would say that that's a beginning. Yeah. And there's lots of work, I think, to be done there. And for me, even when looking at kind of government and what's happening on the grassroots level, that needs to be joined up a bit more, because even and that's starting to happen and starting to look a bit more transparent. And I think that's you know what's needed. And we're not looking for a kind of an excellence, or, you know, when we're looking at issues of race and racism, it's important to acknowledge that they've been around for centuries now. So we're not going to solve it overnight, and that's okay that we're not going to solve it overnight. But we have to make a commitment, and some of that commitment is about taking responsibility, taking individual responsibility, and for those that are in positions of power, taking that responsibility and then moving to action. And I think that that's what we're seeing, that, you know, we're seeing that happening at a snail's pace, but it is happening.
It's happening. Yeah, thanks, Lorraine. And I think when you talk about change, you know, one of the ways that we know change can happen is through organizations. You know, when people come together, that's really where the power is. And so a question for you, Kevin. I know that the consulate is a great supporter of organizations throughout the US, Midwest states. What would your office like to see these organizations doing in terms of inclusion? And are there any funding opportunities prioritized to address this from your office?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Fiona. Yeah, I think many, if I actually can't see who's on the call, but we've got a program called the Immigrant Support Program, which is a large grant program which supports organizations in the work that they do at the diaspora. In the current policy, and then again in the new policy, if we stepped up, there is funding there for organizations that look at issues of diversity and inclusion. And I think as well, from the perspective of the Irish government and the work that we do with the diaspora, it's not just, I suppose, Irish of mixed race. What we're keen to do is as well look at, I suppose, the full richness of the Irish identity. And that includes, both traditions on the island, north and south. And there have been Irish organisations in the Midwest who have been quite progressive in the work that they've done, for example, reaching out to the Ulster Scots community. Because again, it's about reaching out and recognising that there isn't just one Irishness, there isn't just one way to be Irish. And I suppose celebrating the fact that there is difference, rather than trying to, I mentioned to the panels before we joined that, there's a certain point, I think, in certain pubs in Ireland where the "How Irish are you" game comes up, where, for example, if you have an Irish American friend, or a friend who's Irish, Asian Irish or Black Irish, where they kind of get that "How Irish are you" question, and it's where the person that's talking to them essentially defines Irishness down to exclude them, and to only include their version of Irishness. And I think that's something that we really are keen in the work that we do through the Immigrant Support Programme, is to broaden that conversation of what it is to be Irish, and recognise that Irishness is not just, it's not just something that is static and set in stone. It's always been diverse, and particularly now it's getting much more diverse, and we want to celebrate that, not exclude. So the work that Lorraine's doing, and I suppose the work that Michael's doing as well, kind of raising that conversation in Irish America, is something that we're really keen to see happen some more. I think next year we'll have some funds in the consulate to look at this, and maybe look at a speaker series or a number of events around Irish identity and what it is to be Irish. Because I think Lorraine's mentioned a few times this idea of conversation. The Irish are, we're a talking people, and we talk things out. And I think anyone that followed for example, the campaign for marriage equality in Ireland, that was a huge sea change in Ireland. Both, I think, Irish people themselves were surprised at the result and the overwhelming nature of the result. But really what happened there was people went out and had conversations. People talked to people that disagreed with them, or that were, as Lorraine said, nervous about how to have this conversation. And it was, people that went forward and started to have these conversations, friends, neighbours, relations, cousins. I think that's something that we probably need to do for, around the broadness of Irish identity. I think we need to have these conversations. So the work of INAR and IAm Irish is really important for that, understanding of the full richness of Irish identity.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're coming up on time, as far as some time for questions, but I did want to ask you guys one final question, kind of, that we had talked about as we prepared for this. To keep the momentum going, we really want to encourage our audience, as well as their circle and their connections, to take action and to have something positive. We want to share the reality of how the situation is. So if you all could is there any practices or a resource that you could share with the audience on how they can create better awareness of what exactly racism is, and how we can all become better advocates, and I would say the verb of being anti-racist? Lorraine, if you'd like to go and answer that. You're on mute, Lorraine.
Sorry, I've done that again. I've already shared some of those resources on there, but I'm going to talk more on a kind of a practical level on what each individual person can do, because I think, I have lots of kind of mottos about each one teach one, and like tell a friend to tell a friend. And for me, it's about you having a real conversation with yourself about what your own bias are, really understanding what makes you nervous, why you feel like it's okay to be a bystander, why you don't feel like you can step in to call something out, why you think it's okay, and for those of you who don't think it's okay, what are you doing about it? Racism is not a black problem, it's a global problem, it's everyone's problem. If that everybody that identifies with being part of the Irish nation is not included in that, then we have to ask ourselves why. If we're looking at our own circles, our friendship group, the people, like if you're living in the States, if you live in the UK, actually, even when you live in Ireland, there's no excuse that you don't know anybody that's non-Caucasian. Like, there's just no excuse for that. And so you have to ask yourself those kind of questions. Why is this my circle? And educate yourself. Just, that as a real starting point outside of all of the massive things, because You know, when we think about racism, even in workplaces, there's so many racial microaggressions, or, you know, the amount of times that someone has said to me, oh, you're really sassy. You know, what are they actually saying to me in that moment? And kind of thinking about that, thinking about the language that we're using when we're talking about people, thinking about how we can just include people, just on those really basic levels, because if each person takes individual responsibility, we will start to see that change.
That's great. Thanks, Lorraine. Michael, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. And I think there's been a conversation for, I think, white Americans more generally, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter movement, about what white Americans can do to educate themselves and be anti-racist. So I won't repeat all that. There's tons of books to read. There's Twitter accounts to follow. There's Black scholars and scholars of color that have been studying this and talking about this for centuries. So I would ask, I think, you know, white Irish Americans to do some internal reflection, talking to friends, talking to family. I realize this isn't easy work. There's going to be pushback from your community, from yourself. But I think ultimately it can lead to a breakthrough, you know, hopefully, it seems far off, but a happier, more harmonious world. And so to keep this momentum going, I think it really has to start at home, has to start with friends, has to start with family. You know, feel free to look at some of the resources that we talk about in our op-ed at the end of our article. If you don't want to read a book on anti-racism, go on a bike tour sponsored by the Newberry Library about the history of race riots in Chicago. Visit 31st Street Beach to see where, you know, a white mob killed a black swimmer. Those mobs, you know, led by Irish Americans from the South Side. So there's outdoor physical activity that can be part of this education too.
That's great. And I think we're coming up on time with the group. So I want to look at the chat really quick and just ask a question that has come up. And one of the first ones that came up here, actually mentioning one of my favorite people, former President Barack Obama. The question here has, you know, obviously with, you know, having a Black president, has Obama's race been a prominent factor in public discourse in Ireland? And Kevin, if you could kind of approach that question.
Yeah, I think it was, and I think it's just something I did want to come back to just from the earlier piece, and it's just that, you know, there have been these really strong connections between, you know, African Americans and Black Americans and Ireland. And, you know, we look back to Frederick Douglass and the abolitionist who came over and spoke in Ireland, and he speaks, you know, very, you know, glowingly of how it was the first time he felt he was treated as a man first and foremost. That's how he was treated in Ireland, and he was invited by Daniel O'Connell, the Liberator in Ireland, and that was, you know, Ireland has always taken inspiration from the struggles of people in the States, and particularly the African American community. For example, the Civil Rights Movement in the late 60s inspired the Civil Rights Movement in Northern Ireland, which ultimately, you know, over a long period of time led to the Good Friday Agreement and the peace that we see there. So this idea that you know, Ireland is entirely separate or disconnected from what happens to the world outside it is not the case. And again, you know, there was a huge wave of support, I think, you know, right around the world when Barack Obama was elected. You know, the idea that, you know, somebody who came from a community that has been, you know, oppressed and still suffers racism in the States, you know, could become president, I think was something that people found really, really inspiring. I think what was interesting there as well was, you know, we dug back, you know, genealogists dug back and found this Irish heritage, which, you know, Barack Obama himself and his family didn't know that they had. And it was interesting. I was involved in the visit when Obama came over in 2014. And you could see that it wasn't just something that he did for his voters. You know, this connection to Ireland wasn't something he did with his voters. There was really, you know, it was something I think that they really felt. So yeah, no, it did make a big impact, and I think it's something that, you know, it shows that there is that strength of connection, something that we're really keen to explore. And if I can just jump back to the last question, I didn't get a chance to jump in. What can we do? I think if there's, you know, any organisations that are keen to have these conversations, as Lorraine said, they can be difficult conversations to have. I'd like to think that the consulate can help out if anyone wants to do an event. Or wants to reach out to other organisations. We're connected not just to organisations in the Midwest, but right around the US and in our missions around the world. So if anyone's keen to have a conversation, talk to us, and we'd be really keen to help you have that. Thank you.
Great. Well, we're pretty much at time. We could go on and on. I could talk all day, and this has been a great experience, and I think we've had a great conversation. I think, you know, in general, as we look around our world today, I think the one word that still comes to top of mind for me is just hope. Holding on to that hope that we can be actively hopeful, not just kind of passively hopeful, but actively hopeful. So I think you've all given great resources and shared your experiences. I want to thank you guys for joining us, and for our audience as well. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all of the questions, but I think we can all do our part to become active anti-racists in our society, and celebrate our Irish heritage as well, in the same token. Grace, I want to pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. I won't jabber on too much. We were supposed to a hard 9:30 and it's 9:31. Sorry we didn't get to answer all the questions, but feel free to reach out to us, info@irishchicago.org. And if you are an organization who would like to connect and do something together, like I said, reach out to us, info@irishchicago.org. Thank you so much everyone for joining us. And yeah, we'll be in touch with the next one.
Thanks so much.